Okay, we're just going to go ahead and get started, and whoever straggles in, straggles in. So I'm just going to start out reading the memory verse for chapter 2, just so we keep it fresh in our minds. In the New American Standard, it's Proverbs 2, 4, and 5. If you seek her, that is wisdom, if you seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasure, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. So I think where we left off was Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 11 is where we left off last time. So we'll go ahead and open up with a word of prayer and jump right in. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this day and for this opportunity to come out to your house and to study your word. I pray, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would just open up our hearts and our minds and illuminate our thinking. Help us, Lord, as we read your word to be able to understand it so as to apply it to our hearts and our lives and our minds, that we might be conformed more into the image of Messiah Yeshua, and we might be better believers, and we might be able to take what we receive tonight and immediately assimilate it into our lives so that we can immediately walk out these doors and start practicing it and living it. And I just hope that through this Proverbs class, that the theme of Proverbs is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and that as we spiritually accumulate these things, that it would make a noticeable difference in our lives, that people maybe who've known us for years would say, hey, there's something different about you. And then we can just testify to the power of the word and how it has that ability to just transform our hearts and our lives and our minds. We thank you, Lord, for your word, because your word is life. Moses said that it is our life. It's like our instruction manual. But then Yeshua, Jesus, came along, and he's the living manifestation of the written word. So it's kind of like a double life there. So we thank you and we praise you. Bless those who are here in attendance and those who could not come tonight for whatever reason. I pray, Lord, that we would be able to kind of get back in the saddle and the routine, and that we can build back our numbers for the Proverbs class. And Lord, we love you and praise you and ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so Proverbs chapter 2. Since it's been a while, maybe I should just start from the beginning and then just stop at 11 and start expounding on that so we can get a context and remember where we were, because it's been a couple weeks since we've had class. So the heading in the New American Standard Bible of chapter 2 is "The Pursuit of Wisdom Brings Security." And so it reads, "My son, if you will receive my sayings and treasure my commands within you, make your ear attentive to wisdom and incline your heart to understanding. For if you cry for discernment, lift your voice for understanding. If you seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasure, then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity and guarding the path of the just, of justice. And he preserves the way of his godly ones. Then you will discern righteousness and justice and equity and every good course." And so verse 10 is kind of entering into a kind of a new phase or a new thought or a new part in this chapter. It says, "For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul." Now, I know we went over verse 10 already, but just briefly, "For wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul." Kind of reminds me of dieting. Everybody knows it's good to eat raw fruits and vegetables and salads, but it's not like you crave it. You want the Snickers bar. You want the Snickerdoodles. You want the junk food. You want the Doritos. But you have to train your body to crave the things that are good for you. If you go on a fast and start getting off of all of the junk food, I noticed that after, a week or so of not having any Little Debbie cakes and Ho-Hos, that when I bite into one after not having it for a while, it tastes a little too sweet. It's almost too much. And the more junk food you eat, the more desensitized you get to the stuff that's bad for you, and you need more of it to kind of get that sugar rush and that sugar high. So like if you wean yourself off the junk food and start eating the good food, you'll start finding that you actually crave Man, I would just love to bite into a juicy tomato right now. Or, yeah, I'm actually craving carrot sticks. How weird is that? So it's kind of the same thing with wisdom. We feed off of foolishness all the time with television and internet and, social media and all this kind of stuff. And we crave it because we like the drama. We like the sugary sweetness of pop culture. But once we wean ourselves away from it, we start craving knowledge and start craving wisdom. And wisdom and knowledge start becoming pleasant to our soul. It's all that we want. It's all that we crave. So moving on to verse 11, which is where we're going to start our study, it says, discretion will guard you, and understanding will watch over you. So we'll just take the first half of that verse. Discretion will guard you. The word discretion in the Hebrew is mzima. It's an M with an apostrophe, mzima. And it means to plot, to scheme. It implies meditative thought. It implies planning ahead. It implies shrewdness and craftiness. So it says discretion will guard you. So to be discreet or to have discretion means that you kind of have to think on it, meditate on it. You have to start planning ahead and plotting. And I know we usually use the word scheme and shrewdness and craftiness in negative ways, but when you're in spiritual warfare, you've got to be discerning. You've got to have discernment. You've got to plot. You've got to plan. You've got to scheme. Because that's exactly what the devil's doing. You've heard the saying, fight fire with fire. Well, a lot of times when firefighters are battling a forest that's in blazed, they will start a new fire somewhere else to create a line to where when that fire goes, it will run out of fuel. Because the fire that's ahead of it has already consumed everything around it, and there's no more fuel for that fire. So once it hits that fire barricade, it goes out. So sometimes you've got to fight fire with fire. So, you've kind of got to be a little crafty, a little scheming. You got to plot a little bit when you're dealing with spiritual warfare and when you're dealing with things of life, because the enemy's doing that to you. So you kind of got to get the upper hand on the enemy. So it says discretion will guard you. The word guard here is the word Shomeyr, and it means to protect and to preserve. To protect and to preserve. It makes you think of what you see sometimes on the side of squad cars, police cars. It says, such and such county police department, to serve and to protect. That's usually the motto and theme of most every, police force out there. And that's what this word means, Shomeyr. It means to guard, to protect, to preserve. And it kind of reminds you of a bodyguard. What's the job of a bodyguard? It's to preserve your body. To preserve your life. I remember when you hear these stories of presidents, and I remember Ronald Reagan when he was going to be assassinated, and the guy took a bullet for him, and he was in the wheelchair for the rest of his life because he took a bullet for President Ronald Reagan. He was his bodyguard. He guarded his body. Now, probably in the context that Solomon is thinking of is that whenever there was a military leader, let's say it was the king. Because kings went out and led their men into battle. We know that David did, but Solomon lived during peacetime, so it really never says that Solomon went out to war, to battle. So let's use his father David as an example. He had a bodyguard. He had an armor bearer. So an armor bearer is somebody that has a large shield, and they go before the person that they're guarding, whether it's a general, whether it's the king, whether it's the captain. It's usually an important person that the armor bearer is guarding and protecting, shielding, and helping him stay safe as he's fighting elsewhere, as his attentions are drawn elsewhere for battle. So that's what this means. Discretion will be your bodyguard. Discretion will be your armor bearer. And so it says, discretion will guard you. And this first part is referring to close and immediate things at hand. Things that you have to deal with right away. Things that you have to deal with in an instant. Things that just come upon you without you expecting it, but all of a sudden you find yourself having to deal with it. You've got to train your mind to be discreet at the spur of the moment, the drop of a hat. It's like reflexes. Discretion is sort of like a reflex. I love boxing. I love mixed martial arts. And some of these guys, they have wicked fast reflexes, especially the ones that are in the flyweight division. The flyweight division, you almost have to watch their fight in slow motion because they're so fast you miss what they're doing. Now, the bigger guys, the heavyweights, they've got so much bulk and so much weight, you can actually follow their fight and their moves because their bigger mass slows them down a little bit. But you get these flyweight guys, and their reflexes are just unbelievable. And so when somebody hits them, they just automatically know where to hit and how fast and how hard. It's a reflex. They've trained themselves to be reflective like that. And that's the way we need to be with discretion. We need to hone our discretion in such a way that we know exactly what to do right immediately at hand. So discretion will guard you. Discretion will be your bodyguard. Discretion will be your police officer, will be your armor bearer. The second half of the verse says, understanding will watch over you. So knowing what to do and how to do it and why to do it. Understanding the bigger picture, the whole scope of things. Understanding will watch over you. In other words, having the bigger picture or the big picture will watch over you. And then that word watch over is another word that's also translated as guard or guarding. But it's a different word. It's the word natzer or natsar. And that's where we get the word, it says that there's a double meaning. You have netzer and natsar, you have the guard and the branch. So in Isaiah, when it's prophesied that there will be a branch coming from the stem of Jesse or the root of Jesse, it's talking about Yeshua. But it also is talking about him, it's also alluding to him as being a guardian of the word of God, that he's going to guard the laws and instructions of God and show us how to live them out correctly. So the word watch over is natsar, and it implies like a lookout. Somebody who's a guard, somebody who's in a watchtower, somebody who's on top of a wall looking out. Maybe you might want to think of a prison guard, where they're not actually looking inside the prison. They're actually guarding the outside of the prison with a spotlight, making sure there's nobody escaping or nobody trying to break in to break somebody out. It's somebody that's watching over. So it says understanding or knowing the big picture, seeing it all, will watch over you like a watchman on the wall, like a lookout will watch over you. So the second half of this verse is referring to things that are down the road. And you have to have a bird's eye view. You have to have a bigger picture to understand what's coming down the road. So you have to have you have to hone your discretion, which means immediately taking care of something when it pops up immediately. Then you have to have that watching over aspect, that guarding, that natsar aspect, to where you see the bigger picture, the bird's eye view, and you see things down the road. It means planning ahead, So understanding will watch over you. So let's go ahead and move on to verse 12. It says, so discretion and understanding, they will deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. So if you have discretion, you know how to act immediately, you have understanding, you know what to do down the road, you plan ahead, those two things will deliver you from the way of evil. And the word deliver is natsal. So I think Solomon is using a little bit of rhyme here because the word watch over is natsar, natsal. So in the Hebrew, it rhymes. So it says that understanding will watch over you, will natsar, and those things will natsal, will deliver you. So that word deliver, natsal, in the Hebrew means to snatch away. It's where we get the English word, or we use the English word, in other words, rapture. I mean, rapture is not in the Bible. You won't find the word rapture in the Bible. But that's the word that we use when we want to talk about being snatched away, or when we talk about the rapture of the church, quote unquote. It's a snatching away. It's a pulling away. It's being delivered. And that's the picture that this Hebrew word natsal, deliver, is trying to bring across. Being snatched away, being raptured away, being rescued, being recovered. And I kind of think of David here when he was in the Philistine city of Ziklag, that the Philistine king gave to him and his men to live in. Well, they went off raiding and warring at one time, and while they were gone, an enemy came in and plundered and spoiled Ziklag, taking away all their family. And that's also what the word means, to plunder, to spoil. And that's what they did to David. They snatched away, they raptured away, they whisked away David's family and his men's family. And so, as turnabout is fair play, David and his men had to go after and had to rapture them back, snatch them away back, rescue them, recover them, plunder them back from the enemy. So it says to deliver you, so discretion and understanding will deliver you from the way of evil. That word evil, we've gone across this word before in our study. It's the word ra. Ra. And it means evil. And ironically, Ra is also the Egyptian, is named for an Egyptian god. Ra. So Ra means evil, it means inferior, it means bad, it means malignant, it means noxious, it means injurious, and it means hurtful. That's a pretty good definition of evil. Those are all the things that evil wants to do to you. It wants to corrupt you, make you bad. It wants to be malignant like a disease. It wants to be noxious to you. It wants to make you inferior. It wants to injure you, wants to hurt you. So to deliver you, to rapture you, to snatch you away from the way that is injurious, the way that is malignant, and the way that is hurtful. And the second half of the verse says, to walk in the ways of darkness. Oh, no, wrong verse. I jumped to 13, sorry. The second part of verse 12. To deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. From the man who speaks perverse things. So this word man literally means man. It's ish. It's the word ish. And interestingly enough, the word woman is isha. Ish and isha, man and woman. So to deliver you from the way of evil, and I did write an example I failed to mention, to deliver you or to snatch you away, rescue you from the way of evil, the thing that came to my mind is like a little kid playing out in the street, and he's oblivious to the car that's coming his way. All of a sudden, the parent or guardian sees this little child playing in the street, sees that the driver's not paying attention. This kid's going to get run over. They run out into the street and lunge and knock the child out of the way. Or they run by really quick and whisk them away, snatch them away from the street, and saves them in a split second. That's the picture that we get here from the first part of this verse, to deliver you from the way of evil. Or if you want to think of a sports metaphor, it's kind of like when unexpectedly there's a football player that comes and snatches the ball out of the other guy's hands. And he's like, wow, where did he come from and how did he do that? And all of a sudden, the guy who snatched the ball is running towards the end zone. And that's the picture there. So, to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. This word speak is the word devar, and it means to promise, to command, to threaten. And it's almost akin to prophecy in a sense. So when I looked at the definition of the word speaks, devar, to promise, it made me think of a crooked politician. Politician's going to promise you anything to get elected. Funny thing, I don't know if you're keeping up with the politics in the United States, but Bernie Sanders, he's like, yeah, if I'm elected president, I'm going to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And all of a sudden, his own campaign staff said, wait a minute, we're not even getting paid $15 an hour. How about paying us what you promised to pay everybody when you become president? So he was kind of painted in a corner. And so he started paying his staff $15 an hour, but he had to cut their hours in order to make that happen. So because he cut his own campaign staff's hours, that means they're not getting the message of Bernie and free stuff like Bernie wants to. So Bernie has even a less chance of getting elected because he shot his own self in the foot by saying this. I think it's kind of hilarious. I think it's funny. But anyway, so to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks, the man who promises like a politician, the man who speaks to promise to command evil things or perverse things. So devar means to promise, but it also means to threaten. It means to threaten. And when I thought of the word threaten in conjunction with the word devar, I thought of somebody threatening like a murderer. Some murderer, they may come with a mask, or they may come and they're all, scruffy and gruffy, and all of a sudden they come up to you and, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to skin you alive, and I'm going to, stab you 100 times. Well, they're making threats, and they're probably going to follow through on these threats, right? So that's the word speaks. From the man who speaks, who promises and threatens perverse things. The word perverse things is tapuka. That almost sounds like a little disgusting, doesn't it? Perverse things. Tapuka. So kind of like an automatopoeia, right? It sounds like what it means like. Because when you think of something perverse, you kind of curl your nose and get disgusted. And you're like, ugh. So it's got a tapuka. Ugh. So the perverse things means fraudulent. It means perverted. And it means twisted. And it basically implies somebody who has a sick mind. So if you have wisdom, you have knowledge, you have discretion, you have understanding, you are going to be protected and delivered from perverse people and their plots and schemes and the things that perverse people want to do to you. Okay, so we're still in chapter 2, and we're moving on to verse 13 for the ones who just came in. So verse 13, it says, from those who leave the path of uprightness, from those who leave the path of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. So it's still talking about this perverse man in verse 12 that was brought up in verse 12. So discretion and understanding is going to protect you from the perverse man. And verse 13 goes into a description of a greater detail of what this perverse man who speaks perverse things is like, what his character is like. He says, from one who leaves the path of uprightness. So a man who speaks perverse things, he's saying this person was a good guy at one time. He was like, he was a good person, a righteous person, a holy person, and he got turned around. He got led astray. And it says, for those who leave, and the word leave here is azab, and it means to release, to loose, to relinquish, to forsake, to abandon, and to forfeit. From those who forfeit or leave or abandon the path of uprightness. The word path here, it means the way of the wayfarer. It also means the ranks of those who have been called out. So this man who speaks perverse things was once a part of us, we could say. That's what Solomon is describing. Somebody who used to be a part of us, who turned evil. Movie references, you think of Darth Vader, right? Anakin Skywalker was a good guy, was training to be a Jedi Knight, and he was, he was training, and then the Emperor got a hold of him and turned him to the dark side and twisted him, and he became Darth Vader. He left the path of the uprightness of the Jedi, and he walked in the paths of darkness. And you'll see that the verse 13 talks about these paths of darkness. So that's the picture here. From those who leave or abandon or forfeit the path, the wayfarer's way. When you think of a wayfarer, you think of somebody who's on a journey with a purpose. You think of a pilgrim. You think of the book Pilgrim's Progress, which is a perfect story, an analogy in this regards. A sojourner. And that's what the Israelites were. They were sojourners in the land of Israel before it became the promised land, before it became theirs. They were sojourners, right? In a land that wasn't their own. From those who leave the paths or the ranks of those who have been called out. Who leaves the paths, the ranks of uprightness. The word uprightness is yosher or yosher, and it means to be honest and to be fair. And it's implying somebody that may have been a judge. Somebody who may have been in some sort of position of authority. I don't know, maybe Solomon even had somebody personal in mind when he was talking to his sons about this. Maybe somebody in his own cabinet or something at one time, or somebody he knew. So discretion and understanding will deliver you from evil, from the man who speaks twisted and perverse things, from that same man who forfeits the path of unrighteousness, or the path of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness, just like Darth Vader. He turned to the dark side, right? To walk in the ways of darkness. Now, the word ways is direct, and it means one's personal way of living, one's journey, one's moral character, one's habitual ways. That's what it means. And I think in the New Testament, you'll find in the King James where it talks about people's conversation. It's not really talking about them talking to one another or whatever, but in the King James, it means one's way of life, one's habit of living and being, their character, their Christian walk, so to speak. To deliver you from the ways of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the path of uprightness, to walk in the ways, the habitual ways, the moral character of, the personal ways of darkness. The word darkness is choshek, and it means obscurity, and it means dusk. That's the worst time for me for driving, is right when, not when it's dark. When it's totally dark, it's not so bad. But when it's right on the borderline of the edge, when the sun just goes over the hills, it's still light outside, but it's getting dark, everything blends together. You can't really see things clearly. Things get blurred and obscure and fuzzy. Sometimes you can't differentiate the shoulder from the road. And it's really hard to see if a deer comes out in front of you at that time of day, during dusk. And that's what this means. It's choshek. I guess the kids today would call it shady. For somebody who walks, to walk in the ways of being shady or sketchy. They say sketchy too. That's the word that they use all the time now. So that's what this word darkness means. It means to be shady, to be sketchy, to be obscure, to be dark. It implies secrecy. It implies no longer being black and white, but fuzzy and gray. It implies that there's no absolute, but everything is just relative. And this verse reminded me of a passage in John. So it says, from those who leave the path of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. And so in John chapter 3, I'll read this really quickly for you. John chapter 3, starting with verse 19. These are the words of Yeshua, the words of Jesus. He says, and this is the judgment, that light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. Now, I know we're all Christians here. And I know we don't go drinking and carousing and going to bars anymore, but how many has been to a bar? I mean, do they have that place lit up like a Christmas tree and all these bright lights so you can see everybody and everything? No. Bars are dimly lit. They're dark. They're shady. Why? Because people there are doing things they shouldn't do. They're making out in a dark corner where really nobody could see. They're doing drugs under the table. You know, it's shady places. And this is what Yeshua is talking about. Men love darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. What if we went into a lot of bars that are dimly lit and all of a sudden just flipped on all the lights? What would we see going on? Probably things that we could never unsee again. Right? And that's what it's talking about there, that lest their deeds should be exposed. Most crime takes place at night. Why is that? Because you have the cover of darkness to protect you from being caught and being seen. If somebody's trying to break into a window, climb through a window in broad daylight, it's easy to see the guy. But at nighttime, and there's no security lights around or whatever, the guy can take a crowbar and jimmy the window open and sneak through without anybody seeing him or knowing. And you know, it makes me think of cockroaches too. Have you ever been in a place that had cockroaches? I have before. And if you turn the light on, the first thing that happens when the light comes on, those cockroaches scatter and they find a dark place to hide. They'll go under a refrigerator, or they'll go into a vent or somewhere that's dark because they don't like the light. Why? Because cockroaches' deeds are evil. They go and poop over everything. They want to eat your food and they're disease carriers. And that's the way evil is. It wants to spread its malignancy. It's evil, and it does it under the cover of night. So that's what that verse reminded me of. Very good words from Yeshua there. From those who leave the path of uprightness. Now, I know that there's a big controversy, especially in the Baptist denominations. And I know traditionally, United Baptists are more Calvinist or have a more Calvinistic leaning. Free Will Baptist, which is the way I grew up, has more of an Arminianist leaning. So where, you have the once saved, always saved camp, and then that you have the other camp that says you can, I think it's a poor choice of words, you can lose your salvation. I don't believe you can lose your salvation. It's like my car keys. I can lose my car keys. I can't lose my salvation. But you know what also I can do with my car keys? Let's say I'm just sick and tired of my car. I've just had enough and I'm just done with her and I'm going to get me a new car. I can forfeit my car keys and I can go back to the person that I bought it from and slam it in their hands and say, "Here, you take this piece of junk. I don't want it no more. I'm done with it. I'm walking away." It's no longer my car. I forfeited it. And so, the Arminians believe that a person can forfeit they can't lose their salvation, but they believe they can forfeit their salvation. For whatever reason, they can say, "You know what? I don't want to have nothing to do with you anymore, God. I'm out of here. I'm done. Leave me alone. I don't want you to ever bother me again." Whereas the Calvinists would say, "Well, that person wasn't really saved in the first place." So that's kind of like the interesting debate in Christendom, among the Baptist denominations. And that verse kind of made me think of that. For those who leave or forfeit the path of uprightness. They were walking on a good path. They were good guys. You could say that they were believers at one time. But they leave, they forfeit, they abandon the path of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. Maybe we could also apply that to somebody who backslides, who's in a backslidden condition. We don't hear that word very much anymore. Growing up, you heard the word backslide all the time, but I tell you, I haven't heard anybody talk about being backslidden in a long, long time. Haven't heard it behind the pulpit in a while. But what does backslidden mean? It means you go back to the way before you were saved. You kind of fall back into the old habits. Let's say you were saved from drunkenness. Well, you fall back into drunkenness again. You backslide. You fall off the wagon, I guess. To walk in the ways of darkness. We came from darkness. As believers, we came from darkness. We came out of the darkness into the light. And so sometimes people leave the path of the upright for whatever reason. And usually it's a deception of the devil. They say, "Oh, you don't want to hang around these people. They're a bunch of hypocrites. They're just out to judge you and to hurt your feelings." And maybe they get hurt in church for some reason. They're like, "I don't want anything to do with these jokers. I'm going to go back. I'm going to crawl back into my bottle. I'm going to crawl back into my syringe, or I'm going to crawl back into bed with that woman. I'm done." And so, I always wonder if Solomon is actually thinking of a particular person when he wrote this. For those who leave the path of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. Verse 14 further talks about this man who speaks perverse things, who left the way of uprightness to walk in darkness. It gives a further description. It says, "Who delights in doing evil." Who delights in doing evil. When I read that phrase, I think of those cartoons and the bad guys on the cartoons that have the pointy handlebar mustaches and the little goatees and has the thick eyebrows. And these cartoon characters go, they delight in doing evil. They love it so much it just tickles their innards, and they just have to cackle and laugh because the evil plot and scheme is just so delightful to them. That's what it makes me think of. Who delight in doing evil. This word delight means to get a kick out of or to get your thrills out of. It's something that brings you joy. Who delights in doing. This word doing is an interesting word. It's asah, and it means to labor, to work, to toil, to create, or to build. So this is somebody who delights, who gets a joy out of making evil their job. It's somebody who delights in making a career out of crime. It sounds like this is talking about a career criminal, whether he's a con man, whether he's a hitman, whether he's a con artist, whether he's a snake oil salesman, a politician, who delights in laboring or toiling or creating or building evil. So that word evil means to afflict. They not only delight in building up their empire of evil or their creations of evil, they love to inflict that evil on other people. That's another part of where they get their jollies, is they love to see other people suffer. Have you ever met somebody like that, who likes to watch somebody else suffer? That blows my mind. I can't conceive of getting joy out of someone else's sorrow and pain. And you know what? The Lord even warns us about that. Because he commanded, I don't remember the scripture reference right off, but if you have a Strong's Concordance or have the almighty Google, you'll be able to find this verse pretty easy. But it talks about that the Lord says, be careful, don't delight when your enemy stumbles, or don't delight when your enemy falters or fails or is defeated. Because if you have joy over your enemy's defeat, I might actually feel sorry for them and turn against you. And this reminds me of the battle that goes on between the Palestinians and the Israelis in the land of Israel. Whenever anything bad happens to Israel, you see the Palestinians dancing in the street, waving their flags, shooting off fireworks. They're taking pleasure and joy in Israel's demise. When 9/11 happened in the United States and the towers fell, there was footage of Arabs and Muslim extremists in the Middle East dancing and clapping and enraptured joy over the tragedy that happened in New York. They were delighting in this evil. They were delighting in the affliction of somebody else suffering, because the Muslim world thinks that America, North America, is the great Satan. So it says, for those who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil. So the word rejoice means to eagerly anticipate. It means to chomp at the bit. They just can't wait to do something bad. They just can't wait to do evil, because that's where they get their kicks. Who rejoice, who are eager, who eagerly anticipate the perversity. Now, this word perversity is the same word that we encountered in verse 12, tapuka. So it means fraudulent, perverted, twisted, and it implies somebody that's a sick mind. So they are eager to engage in this fraudulent, perverse, twisted, sick-minded activity. And rejoice in the perversity of evil. And it's the same word as in verse 12. It's ra. And it also means to inflict or cause grief on somebody. So verses 12 through 14 is talking about this one person that used to be a good guy and now has turned a bad guy. And to me, there's no more evil person than somebody who used to be good. Usually if there's a wicked person and a bad person, they don't really know what it means to be good, and they can only be bad to a certain extent. They don't have anything to compare their badness to because they've always been bad. But somebody who's been good, they have something to compare their badness to. Well, if I was this holy and this good, I'm going to be this much more evil and this much more bad. It makes you think of Lucifer. It makes you think of his Hebrew name, Hillel, the fallen angel. He knew what it meant to be good. He was a throne guardian of God. He was a cherub. And that word cherub is not just a rank or a class of angel. It talks about how he was a throne guardian. He was a bodyguard of God, like as if God needed a bodyguard, right? But he was one that praised God, that circled the throne, holy, holy, holy. And then he says, you know what? I'm done with this. I'm going to set my throne above the stars. And you know, I'm going to reach the heights. And he was going to take over heaven. So that's kind of what this reminds me of here too. So moving on to verse 15. Whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. Whose paths are crooked. In verse 8, we dealt with the word paths, and it's the same word there. It's orak, and it means a path or way, and it could be used figuratively, and it's an ideology. So it's whose ideology or whose ways of thinking, whose mental pathways are crooked. The word crooked means contrary, distended, twisted, perverted. You know, crooked is pretty self-explanatory when you think about it. Whose ideology is perverted, twisted, crooked, and whose ways are devious. Whose ways, the word way it means a trench. So their ideology has become an entrenched pathway in their mind. So, okay, for instance, like you've got to train your brain to do certain things. When I was little, I couldn't do this. I couldn't pat my head and rub my tummy at the same time like I'm doing now. I couldn't do that when I was little. You know, I'd get all messed up. And I couldn't do it. But the more I did it and the more I practiced it, all of a sudden now I can pat my head and rub my tummy without even thinking about it. I've created an entrenched pathway in my brain where I automatically do it without thinking. I don't have to think, okay, what's my right hand doing? What's my left hand doing? It's the same thing when I took up playing drums. It was hard to drum with my hands and hit the bass pedal with my foot. I would get all wonky and out of sync. But the more I practice it, I train my brain to create that pathway. And now it's a reflex. Now it's automatic. And that's what it's talking about. Whose mental pathways are crooked. They're carved in. They're set in. They've been entrenched. It's reflexive now. Their crookedness is almost a reflex now. And who are devious in their ways. Their ways have become entrenched. They've become entrenched. Verse 16, to deliver you from the strange woman. So we're ending this passage about talking about this good guy who turned bad, this perverse man, and now we're talking about how discretion and understanding in verse 11 is going to deliver you from certain things, and in verse 16, it's going to deliver you, it's going to rapture you away, going to rescue you, snatch you away from the strange woman. Now, this word strange woman is zur. Now, I think that there is a rhyming thing going on here in Proverbs that you really don't see in the English, because in verse 15, the word devious is lose. Is lose, zur, lose, or so you still got that oo sound. So the words kind of connect. It's almost like a rhyme. So strange woman is zur, and it means somebody who is a non-relative or a foreigner. So usually when this word is used, it's used in reference to a pagan woman, to a woman who's not an Israelite, who worships usually the Canaanite deities, the Canaanite pantheon, strange gods. It's a strange woman. And a lot of times the word strange woman is also used not only as an ethnic identifier, but as a religious identifier too, because sometimes these strange women, that word was used in reference to temple prostitutes. Because that is the way the Canaanites worship their gods, is if they were able to have sex with the priest or the priestess in the temple, they were therefore communing sexually with their god, because that priest or priestess was the mediator between God and man. So if you were intimate with that priest, you were being intimate with that deity that you were serving or worshiping. So those are the different definitions for a strange woman. And it reminds me of that passage in Proverbs that we're going to get to later on, where it talks about how Solomon says, I saw out my window through my lattice, I saw a young man. He was a fool. He was going out, and it talks about how he met this woman and how she was brazen-faced. And she says, oh, I perform my vows today and perform my sacrifices. And I went home and spread my beds full of Egyptian linen and these, cinnamon and spices. And my husband's gone with a big bag of money. He won't be back until next month. Let's make love until morning. And it said that she was brazen, and she grabbed him and led him like a sheep to the slaughter. So we're talking about an aggressive woman here. Somebody, and I tell you, when you're tempting a guy in that manner, it doesn't really take a lot. But she's just like, this woman in this verse is implying somebody who is seductive, a woman who throws herself at you. To deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress. Now that word adulteress says a lot. A single person can't be an adulteress. They can be a fornicator, but they can't be an adulteress. A fornicator is somebody who's single and has sex outside of marriage. An adulteress is somebody who is married and is unfaithful to their spouse and has sex with somebody outside of their marriage. To deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words. So flatter means to separate, to smooth, to be smooth by words. So, when you're being led away with flattery, you're being coerced, you're being seduced. To deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words. So, what is this prostitute, this adulteress, this strange woman? She is separating one from her spouse. She is separating one from their money. And she is separating one from their reputation. Because when you're caught in adultery, you're going to lose your spouse. Now, I don't know how many used to watch wrestling, but anybody remember the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase? I just saw a fantastic interview with him on skywatchtv.com. And he, was a big famous wrestler. His character was this villain who was rich. And his saying was, everybody's got a price. I can win because everybody's got a price, and I got enough money to buy people. He even created his own wrestling belt. It wasn't an official title or an official belt, but it was this, anyway. But he got caught up in the fame and fortune of being a wrestler, and he ended up sleeping around. And he felt so bad afterwards, he called his wife and told her what happened. And he says, honey, we'll talk about this when I get home. She says, what do you mean when you get home? You don't live here anymore. And that was a wake-up call for him. And he ended up finding the Lord, getting himself right with the Lord, and God restored and healed their marriage. But when somebody commits adultery and is unfaithful, they're separated from their spouse. They're separated from their money. Because you know what? You're going to lose money because, especially if you're paying a prostitute. And you're going to be separated from your reputation. You're going to get a bad reputation. I mean, Bill Clinton was known as the president of the United States of America. But what else is he known for? Yep, Monica Lewinsky. That sticks with you. You can't wash that off or get rid of that. Even if it's proven wrong or you've been exonerated, people will still have that in their mind. So those are the things that a person loses when they submit or succumb to the seduction of a strange woman, of an adulteress. And it says that she leads away by the flattery of her words. The word for words here in the Hebrew implies a sales pitch. Of course, somebody is going to be, if they're faithful to God, they're going to be resistant to this temptation of adultery. But then the prostitute or the adulteress starts giving this sales pitch and saying how good it's going to feel, how, nobody will ever know, and just try to convince this person to be led away. Because again, the verse implies that she's aggressive. She's throwing herself at this person. Okay, moving on. To deliver from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words. King Solomon is warning his sons, who are judges and ambassadors and future rulers of the kingdom, that this is one way they can lose their reputation and status as a child of the king. And he's warning against this, because with money and with power of being a ruler, you'll have that temptation that you can have whatever you want. David thought that. He decided not to go to war one time, was looking out his window and saw Bathsheba bathing and said, I want her, and I can have her because I'm the king. Everybody else is to war. Nobody's going to know. Right? Maybe Solomon was thinking of his own dad in this verse. I don't know. Verse 17, that leaves the companion of her youth. So it's still talking about this adulteress. That leaves the companion of her youth. And that word leave is the same word as we encountered in verse 13, where it means to forsake or to abandon. And the word companion, it's a term of royalty or of loyalty, as if your spouse, as in your spouse. So this word leaves the companion of her youth. You know, she forfeits the loyalty to this spouse, to this companion. The companion of her youth. So this word for youth, it could imply an arranged marriage, or it could be one of these marriages where you feel that you've been destined for this person since birth. Now, do you believe that God had your spouse picked out for you? I mean, do you believe that it's only, one woman for one man for one woman? That God has a person out there for you? That's what I believed. And I remember in high school, I was getting ready to go to college. And I remember laying in bed at night, going to bed, and I'd be laying on my pillow, have my hands underneath my head, looking up at the ceiling, and I said, Lord, bless my wife. I don't know where she is, I don't know who she is, but Lord, if she's not saved, Lord, bring her to salvation. If she is saved, help her to stay faithful. Prepare her for me and prepare me for her. And now when I look at Pam, I think, that's who I prayed for. That's the one that God had for me. So this is what it's saying here. That leaves the companion of her youth, somebody that God had appointed, somebody that maybe even it was an arranged marriage because that was a thing back then, who leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. When you get married, you're just not making a promise between you and your spouse. You are making a promise between you and God. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the presence of God to join this man and this woman, right? So it's a covenant not only between two persons, but those two persons and God. Who forfeits the covenant. This word covenant is brit. And this word is used a lot in Jewish circles. You have the Brit Chadashah. The Brit Chadashah is the Hebrew word for the New Testament. It means the renewed covenant. The word Brit is covenant. You have the word Brit Milah. Brit Milah is the covenant of circumcision. So you have different words with the word Brit in it. Who forgets the covenant, the Brit of her God. Okay, we still have a little bit more time. I'm going to push it tonight. It's been a while, I miss teaching. So, I was having teaching withdrawals, right? Okay, so verse 18. For her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead to the dead. Her house. Now, a lot of times in the Western world, when we think of house, we think of, 4 walls and a roof. But this is really not what house means. House means somebody's lineage. So like in the medieval times where there was knights and the House of Lords, or the House of Dunkirk, or the House of this, or if you're into Star Trek, I am Worf, son of Moog of the House of Moog, or So that's what house means. It means a family lineage, a family dynasty. For her lineage, her dynasty sinks down into death. This word sinks means to be humbled, to be disgraced. Her household, her family, her race, her descendants is humbled and is disgraced and sinks down into death. The word death means Rapha, and it means feeble, weak, drained of blood. So it's not an instant death, it's a slow death. It's a lingering death. It's like sometimes when you bleed out an animal, it takes a while for that animal to die. It's a slow death. For her house sinks down to death, and her tracks lead to the dead. The word tracks here means trench. So her tracks lead to the dead. So, in other words, breaking the covenant of God, breaking the covenant of marriage, the sacred bond of marriage, the marital bed as being sacred, when you do that, that leads to death. It may feel good at the moment, but it leads to death. You know, just like drugs. I mean, people are hooked on meth for a reason, because it feels good. It gives them a great high, but you know what? It's a slow death. It leads to death. It takes life from you. It doesn't give life to you. And that's what adultery is all about. That's what it is. And it says, none who go to her return again. To go to means, the implication is to go to her. It's that one flesh. It implies soul ties. It implies a sexual nature. Those who go to her, those who have sex with her, will not return again. They will not do an about face and return back to the way they were. They will continue on that path to destruction. Nor do they reach the path of life. Nor do they obtain the path. They don't go back to the ranks of the righteous. Nor do they reach the ranks or the path of life. The word life is chai. It means sustained life. It means revived. It means being revived from sickness to death. So Solomon is looking at adultery as a disease, as something that kills. And that if you stay far away from it, you will gain life. But if you go down that path, you will lose your life. And if you remain unrepentant in the sin of adultery and sexual sin, it's going to take your life. It's going to be a slow suicide. I mean, have you looked at prostitutes who have been in the business for a long time? They are ragged. They are worse for wear. Look at Bill Clinton. He's not a repentant adulterer. Bill Clinton looks like death warmed over. He's looking pretty sickly these days. He has not found the path of life because he hasn't repented. He has not done that 180. He has not returned. So people continue on this pathway and continue on that lifestyle. I have heard a testimony of a man who believed he was a woman, who was transgender, and he lived his life as a woman, got saved, and he changed his ways. He says, I cannot refer to my transgender lifestyle. I can't refer to it as a lifestyle. I have to refer to it as a death style, because it just led me down the path of death. He was so deep into this transgender, believing that he was going to have a sex change. He came this close from having a sex change. And he said he lost count of how many people he had been intimate with. He got to the point where he contracted HIV. He was dying on his deathbed. And not only did the Lord save him spiritually, saved him physically. And the doctor says, we've never seen anything like this before. This is a miracle. And he said, this is a death style. It's not a lifestyle. It felt good to my flesh. It felt good to my carnality, but it led me down the path of death, spiritually and physically. How many STDs do we have today and sexually transmitted diseases that are pretty wicked diseases? Al Capone had syphilis. What does syphilis do? It makes you go insane. It makes you go mad. So there's a lot of wicked diseases that are contracted sexually. It leads you down the path of death. And that's what Solomon is trying to bring across here. And if you're not repentant and change your ways, that's exactly what's going to happen. So you will walk in the way of good men. So the word walk is a halakha. It's a custom, it's a manner, it's a tradition, it's a discipline, it's a structured life. So it says in verse 20, so you will walk in the way of good men. The word, find it here. You will walk in the way of good men and keep the paths of the righteous. The word righteous here is the word zadik. And the Jews still use this word. They will call, like a lot of their rabbis and sages, they will call them zaddiks. And the word zadik means holy men, means righteous men. So that's verse 20. So you will walk in the way of good men, and you will keep, you will shamar, you will guard, you will preserve the way, the manner, the habit, the path of the righteous, of the holy men, of the zaddik. For the upright, and that's the same word as verse 7, for the upright will live in the land. For the upright will live in the land. This word live means to dwell, means to inhabit, means to settle. So it's a permanent place. For the upright will thrive and live and settle and dwell and make a living and make their home, put down their roots in the land. The word land is eretz. And a lot of times if you speak Hebrew, you'll hear Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael means the land of Israel. So a lot of times when you hear a Jewish person say Eretz, the land, they may not say Israel, but when they say the land, Eretz, they're referring to Israel. They're referring to the promised land. So Solomon is saying, for the upright, for those who keep God's commandments, for those who are righteous and holy, will live, will dwell in the land. They will get the promised land of God. They will live in the land of promise spiritually and physically, is what's being implied here. And the blameless will remain in it. The word blameless means entirely whole, perfectly sound, without spot. In other words, you can't pick anything bad out. You can't find anything to disqualify. This reminds me of a little skit I seen years and years ago on Saturday Night Live, when Saturday Night Live was still funny. It's not funny anymore. It's obnoxious. But you had this military sketch where you had this sergeant that was bringing in these new recruits. And you always have to break down a new recruit. So you're going to badmouth them, you're going to make fun of them, you're going to, to urge them to do their best. So he went to each and every soldier, and he had something to complain about this soldier, to make fun of this soldier with. But he came across this one soldier. He couldn't find anything wrong with him. I mean, he was the perfect specimen of a man. He had his uniform pressed, his boots shined, his hair, he was just perfect. And so the sergeant is really wanting to break this man down, but he couldn't find anything to bring this guy down. He was spotless. He was perfectly whole and sound and blameless. So he's like, why look at you with your ankle connected to your foot that way? Pretty ridiculous, right? He just had to make something up because he couldn't find anything to blame this guy with. So that's what the word blameless is. To be entirely whole, perfectly sound, without spot. To be a perfect specimen. For the upright will live in the land, and the blameless will remain. The word remain means to be left behind. They will remain in it. They will remain in it. They will be left behind. Verse 22, but the wicked will be cut off. The word wicked is rasha, and it comes from the word ra, evil. Rasha means morally wrong. Morally wrong, but the morally wrong will be cut off. And that word cut off is karath, and it literally means to castrate. And it has the implication that your family lineage, your family line will be no more. It's going to come to an end. And how did God punish a lot of the wicked and evil and rebellious people in Israel? He cut off their lineage. He said, Saul, you and your family are not going to be king anymore. David is. And all of his family died on the hillside. Well, he did have some relatives that David took care of, Mephibosheth, but his line was cut off. There was a couple priests that were cut off. When Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, offered strange fire to the Lord, they were cut off. They had no descendants. You had other wicked priests later on that God said, and it was Eli's sons. It says, you're going to be cut off. You're going to be castrated. You're going to be cut off. You're not going to have any more descendants. They're not going to be in the priesthood. And even if there was, and even if they did survive, they would be begging for their jobs, and they're not going to get a priestly job. They're going to be leprous. They're going to be cursed. And so the sons of Zadok eventually took over the priesthood and were the ones who carried it on. So that's what the word cut off means. The wicked will be cut off from the land. They won't inherit it anymore. They're not worthy to inherit it or to dwell in it or to live in it. They're going to be excommunicated and kicked out and never allowed to be back in. Adam and Eve were cut off from Eden. They were cut off from the garden, right? And they had the angel there with a sword ready to cut them in half if they tried to get back in. And the treacherous will be uprooted from it. Wow, that's a powerful image, right? To be uprooted. To be uprooted. It makes me think of a weed. I learned from my mom that when you pull a weed, you just can't grab the top of the weed and pull it because the roots are really strong and you'll just rip out the top of it, right? You've got to get down, right down to the ground, and you've got to get your forefinger and your thumb nubby nub down to the ground in the dirt. And what you do is you grab it and you pinch it and you twist it and pull it up. That's what it's an interesting thing to uproot. And you can feel the resistance of that weed wanting to stay in the ground. And you can feel it not wanting to let go of its domain, and you uproot it. And it says the treacherous. And that word treacherous means to be deceitful, unrighteous, and unfaithful. To be sketchy, to be shady, to put it in the modern day vernacular. The treacherous will be uprooted. And that word uprooted is nakak, and it means to tear away, to destroy, to expel, to banish, to pluck out. I know I went a little bit over my time, but I'm hoping that you hung with me. I was hoping to get through chapter 2 to make up for the couple weeks that I wasn't here because I was on vacation. So the good news is we've made it through chapter 2. The bad news is next week there's a quiz. Proverbs chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Memorize it and be ready for the quiz. And let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Our dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this day and thank you for this time. It's so good to be back together again with family and friends to study your word, to really dig into your word, and to just suck it out, suck the marrow out of the bone, to get every bit of nutrients we can out of your word. And Lord, I pray, God, that as we feast upon your word, that, Lord, that the things of the sicky sweetness and the junk food of this world that we are surrounded with pop culture, with TV and music and movies, that those things will just kind of start to be a little too sicky sweet for us. It would be a little bit distasteful, a little bit nauseous to us. And that, Lord, as we feast on your word each week, that we'll get that good spiritual nutrition and we'll start craving your word like we eventually start craving good whole foods, raw fruits and vegetables and salads and good stuff that's good for us. We want to crave your word like that, God. So help us, Lord, to apply it to our hearts and lives this week. Help us to even go home and maybe read over the chapter again and just to remind ourselves of what we were taught and what we learned tonight. And Lord, we love you and we praise you and we ask these things in Yeshua's name. Amen. How many's been keeping up with the Proverbs reading for a proverb a day, right? Each day you read a proverb. So today is the 24th, right? Did you read Proverbs 24? Keep every month. Yeah, you can go through the Proverbs in a month. That's what's cool about it. And the Proverbs are always good, never gets old. So you can read a proverb a day because most months have 31 days. Some of them have 28. But anyway, so keep that up and go over your memory verse, and we'll see you next week. And if you know somebody who wasn't here, invite them back. Say, hey, we started class again, so come back.
AbrahamsDescendants.com, getting back to the first century in a 21st century way. The Plaster Rock United Baptist Church. Come join us every Sunday morning at 11 a.m.